I thought I could handle it, but deep down, I knew it was tearing me apart. We all have our breaking points. Mine just came silently. I said I was okay with it, but my heart was screaming something different. Sometimes, the things we agree to aren't as simple as they seem. It wasn't what was said, but what was left unsaid that cut the deepest. The silent deal breaker that no one saw coming, but I felt it in every fiber of my being. How do you move forward when the unspoken words begin to echo? I kept telling myself, I'm fine, but the truth was slipping through the cracks. When you pretend to be okay with something, but it quietly eats at your soul. We think we can endure, but the little things have a way of breaking us. I agreed, but something inside me was quietly dying. The quiet moments speak louder than any argument ever could. In the silence, I discovered the deal breaker I was too scared to confront. I told myself I was okay, but my heart was silently protesting. It was a deal, a promise, but the silence told a different story. I never thought silence could speak so loudly. What happens when you're okay with something until you're not? I smiled and nodded, but inside I was slowly unraveling. Every unspoken word weighed heavier than the ones we exchanged. I agreed, but in the quiet of my mind, I knew this wasn't right. It wasn't until later that I realized how much I had been lying to myself. The truth always finds its way out, even in silence. I convinced myself I was fine, but my heart knew the truth. In the stillness of those moments, I felt the shift I couldn't ignore. When we say we're okay, but deep down, we know we've crossed a line. I was pretending, but inside I was falling apart piece by piece. It was subtle, silent, but it was the beginning of the end. I told myself I could live with it, but I was just fooling myself. How many times can you say, I'm okay, before it starts to feel like a lie? The deal breaker wasn't what was said, it was what we both refused to acknowledge. In the silence, the weight of unspoken truth became unbearable. Sometimes we make deals with ourselves that we can't keep. I thought I had accepted it, but in truth, I was only pretending. It wasn't the big things that broke me. It was the quiet compromises. We said we were okay with it, but the silence between us was louder than any argument. In the quiet spaces, I realized something was missing, and it was everything. What happens when you're forced to swallow your feelings because you promised to be okay? It started as a small agreement, but it became the reason everything fell apart. I thought I could handle it, but the silence was the real killer. We make silent agreements, but sometimes they cost us in a more than we realize. When you say, I'm fine, but your heart screams, I'm not. I convinced myself it was nothing, but everything about it felt wrong. In that moment, I realized saying I was okay was the biggest lie I'd ever told. What do you do when the deal breaker isn't a loud argument, but a quiet truth? I told myself I could live with it, but my heart knew it was slowly dying. It wasn't the words, but the silence that said it all. I thought I was okay, but it turns out I was just waiting for the inevitable. We say we're okay with things, but sometimes those things break us in ways we don't understand. It wasn't a big betrayal. It was 1,000 small moments that led to the breaking point. I was pretending everything was fine, but inside I was screaming. The deal breaker didn't hit me like a hammer. It slowly suffocated me in silence. I thought silence meant peace, but it was actually the beginning of everything falling apart. I said I was okay with it, but deep down, I knew I was lying to myself. How do you heal from something that was never spoken aloud, but still broke you inside? The silent deal breaker crept up on me, and by the time I noticed, it was too late. In the quiet moments, I realized how much I had been sacrificing without even knowing. It wasn't the loud fights that tore us apart. It was the unspoken truth we ignored. I thought I had accepted it, but my soul was telling me something else entirely. The silent moments were where everything began to unravel. I said I was okay, but I knew deep inside I wasn't, and I never would be again. I kept saying I was fine, but the emptiness kept growing inside me. We've all been there, pretending we're okay when the silence is suffocating us. The moment I realized I wasn't fine, it was too late to turn back. I said I was okay, but inside my world was crumbling. It's amazing how silence can scream louder than words ever could. I told myself I was strong enough, but this silent burden proved me wrong. Sometimes you don't realize you're drowning until you're already underwater. We keep pushing down our feelings, hoping they'll disappear, but they never do. It was the quiet that hurt the most, the quiet that spoke the truth I wasn't ready to hear. I said I was okay, but my heart knew better than to lie. The silence between us wasn't peaceful. It was a quiet storm waiting to break. I thought I was in control, but this silent deal breaker was slowly pulling me apart. You can tell yourself you're fine, but your heart will always know the truth. I said yes, but inside, something in me was already saying no. Sometimes the hardest truths are the ones we refuse to speak aloud. I thought I could handle the silence, but it turned out to be my greatest enemy. Every time I said I was okay, I was burying another part of myself. I didn't realize how much I was hurting until I looked into the silence. We all have our limits, but sometimes we don't recognize them until it's too late. It wasn't the loud moments that broke me. It was the quiet ones that I couldn't escape. I thought I could stay strong, but the weight of unspoken feelings eventually crushed me. We try to convince ourselves that we're okay, but eventually, the truth always catches up. It's in the silence where we find the things we've been avoiding all along. I kept telling myself it was fine, but my emotions were fighting back. The quiet between us became the loudest thing in my life. I thought I could keep pretending, but I was slowly breaking inside. What do you do when you realize the deal breaker is something you never even noticed? I thought I had accepted it, but it turns out I never truly did. It wasn't the agreement that broke me, it was what was missing. I tried to ignore it, but silence has a way of exposing the truth. The moment I said I was okay, everything inside me screamed I wasn't. I said yes, but something in me was already saying goodbye. I kept telling myself I was fine, but every silent moment proved me wrong. You can convince the world you're okay, but you can never convince your heart. It wasn't the words that hurt, it was the silence that said everything I needed to know. I thought I could let it go, but the silence between us only made it worse. We make so many silent agreements, but we never realize their weight until it's too late. The silent deal breaker wasn't loud, but it was undeniable. I said I was fine, but inside, I was losing myself piece by piece. The quiet became unbearable, and I knew I could no longer pretend. Sometimes we don't see the damage until we're standing amidst the wreckage. I thought silence would heal, but instead, it just deepened the wound. The quiet moments held more pain than I ever imagined. I was lying to myself, but eventually the truth came rushing in. Every time I said I was okay, the silence between us grew heavier. I thought it didn't matter, but the silence was eating away at everything I believed. It wasn't the big arguments, it was the little silences that made me question everything. I kept telling myself I could handle it, but it was slowly destroying me. The deal breaker wasn't a sudden betrayal, it was a slow, silent shift. In the silence, I discovered a truth I wasn't ready to face. The silence was louder than any fight we ever had. I said I was fine, but in reality, I was breaking down in silence. We often ignore the small things, but they have the power to change everything. I thought the silence would fade, but it only grew louder with time. I convinced myself it didn't matter, but the truth kept clawing its way out. The hardest part isn't the fight. It's when the silence takes over and everything falls apart. I said I was okay, but deep down, I was screaming for something to change. The silence between us was suffocating, but I didn't know how to fix it. You can pretend to be fine, but the silence will eventually reveal the truth. It wasn't the words that broke me, it was the things we never said to each other. I thought I could ignore it, but the silence became unbearable. I kept convincing myself I was fine, but in the quiet moments, I realized I wasn't. The unspoken truths were slowly tearing us apart, and I didn't know how to stop it. I said I was okay, but inside I felt the weight of everything I had kept quiet. It was a silent deal breaker, one I couldn't ignore any longer.